This week, we are discussing the potential impact of Bitcoin and blockchain technology in Afghanistan. I'm joined now by Alex Zerden, founder of Capital Peak Strategies and formerly a part of the U.S. Treasury Department attached to the American Embassy in Kabul. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Isaiah, thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, yeah. Glad to be speaking with you, brother. Glad you could be on the show. So I wanted to start off, tell us a little bit about Capital Peak Strategies and some of the work you've done in the fintech industry.
Yeah, so Capital Peaks is a fintech and crypto advisory. So we work with early stage companies and other organizations to help them deal with risk, compliance, legal, regulatory, government affairs challenges, and to really bridge the gap between what's going on in Washington, D.C., and capitals around the world and state capitals, and the crypto industry and the fintech industry.
Oh, yeah. Love to hear it. And we definitely need those services. And I also want to ask about some of the work you've done in Kabul as well, as a part of the U.S. Treasury Department. What's some of the work that you've done in Kabul?
So that was a really incredible and privileging opportunity for me. So I deployed in 2018 to run the U.S. Treasury Department's office at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan. So the Treasury Department sends a number of these financial attaches around the world. Some of them are in large economies, think like China and Japan and Mexico. And then others are in places with large problems with money laundering, terrorism financing, economic sanctions, corruption, and narco-terrorism risks. And Afghanistan kind of falls in that back bucket. And so for going to Afghanistan, we had two main missions there. One was to support the U.S. government's efforts in Afghanistan. So that's on counterterrorism. That was supporting the Afghan government, the Afghan people. And then the other part was working on Afghan economic stability. So actually working with the Afghan government ministries, private sector, banking sector, as well as other parts of the financial services community. So I got a really interesting understanding of the economic landscape in Afghanistan. The troubling part, though, is the economy is really driven in a large component by foreign assistance. That's U.S. tax money, taxpayer assistance from other donors around the world. And then, unfortunately, and this is a major driver of economic activity in the country, is the heroin and methamphetamine trades. And so that's really the only major thing that Afghanistan produces that the rest of the world consumes. Otherwise, it's a little bit of other agriculture, and then a little bit of like carpets and some other things. But heroin and sadly methamphetamine are two major exports that have been coming out of the country for decades now.
Oh, yeah. And that's great to know, because I know a lot of our viewers don't really realize the economy of Afghanistan, and you have extensive research and time that you put in there. So one of the things I wanted to ask is, we've seen what has happened in Afghanistan sort of on the news, maybe not have a lot of insight, but following the Taliban takeover, according to reports, Afghanistan has faced a nationwide cash shortage, closed borders, a plunging currency, rapidly rising prices in goods. And, a lot of banks were forced to close. Even Western Union had to suspend services. So what is the situation now on the ground in Afghanistan following this past exit from the U.S. troops?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The situation is not good, and so I don't want to sugarcoat things. The economy was in a really challenging situation before the Taliban's violent takeover of the country. About a third of the country suffered from food insecurity. About 90% of the country, or roughly 36 million people, lived on $2 a day or less, according to the Afghan government's own statistics. And so it was a really troubled economy going into this crisis. Between somewhere around 1 in 10 Afghans held bank accounts. That number plummeted to about 1 in 25, or 3.8% of women. And so there wasn't the type of financial services that you and I would recognize in the United States and in other developed countries around the world. It had a very different posture and a very different feel and look to it. And so what filled in a large part of the economic activity, a large part of financial activity, was the so-called Hawala system. And it's kind of like an informal Western Union, informal MoneyGram system that allowed people to move money around the country and around the world with relatively low amount of oversight. And that's a problem for money laundering, terrorism financing, and corruption, and drug trafficking. But it also, were cheaper fees, and it was easier for those people who are making less than $2 a day to move that money around to a family member, or to receive money from overseas from a family member as well. And so that plugged a lot of the gap of the financial services. And it's actually an interesting kind of bridge to crypto, and I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit as well. But happy to discuss. And then the situation now is really bad. So as I mentioned, the Taliban violently overtook the country. They had been involved in a peace process. I had arrived in Afghanistan just as that peace process between the United States and the Taliban was starting in 2018. But a component of that was to be bringing in the rest of the Afghan government, the Afghan people into these peace negotiations. And the Taliban would be part of a power sharing government. That was the desired end state of these negotiations. But the Taliban, they unfortunately negotiated in bad faith, and they made very significant battlefield gains during these 2.5 years of negotiations. And so while taking over the country, they didn't realize, or they didn't appreciate, or they didn't care that there were going to be major economic consequences. And so, you were just describing this, but Western Union and MoneyGram temporarily suspended their operations. They've restarted it. The international community suspended aid, which was a major driver of their economy, about 40% of their GDP, 75% of their government budget. So those were millions of people who were being helped by that money. That stopped effectively overnight. And then the U.S. government blocked and froze about $9 billion, according to public reports, of international reserves, which is the rainy day fund for the Afghan people, held in trust by the Afghan government. And so that money is parked in New York and other capitals around the world. And then the other part of this is the Afghan economy is heavily reliant on dollars, physical cash, and also Afghani, the local currency. And those shipments, there was a reported shipment that was supposed to arrive the day that Kabul fell of physical cash US dollar banknotes. And that money didn't arrive. So there's a cash shortage as well on the ground. So the economy is in really rough shape. You're seeing people are selling their family, family cherished items and basic things to just buy bread for keep their kids fed. It's a really, really bad situation. And this is, I see this from where I sit. This is a choice made by the Taliban, and they have to be the ones who change their behavior and change their actions, because they're the ones who got us into this crisis in the first place.
I see. And I want to follow that up with asking, do you have any insights into whether the Taliban themselves are actually using crypto, or what their plans might be in regards to financial reform? Or is it sort of like a dog chasing cars? Even if they caught it, they wouldn't know what to do with it. Is that sort of the situation?
Yeah, so there's evidence out there that terrorist groups in general have used cryptocurrencies. In terms of the Taliban, there's not much evidence demonstrating that. I believe there was a very helpful report put out by the analytics team at Coinbase recently that demonstrated incredibly minuscule the amount of money associated with terrorist organizations in Afghanistan. So if I were the Taliban and what they've been reported to be doing, they move money through the Hawala system. The U.S. sanctions and UN sanctions that have been in place for over 20 years. An international community have come together to deprive the Taliban of access to the formal financial system. And so they've had to use the Hawala system. They've had to go through other channels. And so that really shows the strength of U.S. economic sanctions, as well as the anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing regime that the U.S. international community have put into place over the past 20 years since the terrible 9/11 attacks. And so for the Taliban, if they want to move money, I think they're known vehicle. They know the Hawala system. I've written about it, that there's demonstrated evidence of them using the Hawala system to move large amounts of money. Again, in such a poor country, there was a Taliban financier that moved about $500,000 last year. That's a lot of money when most people, the average GDP is about $500 a year. And so they use their normal channels, their known channels. And so, evidence of Taliban involvement in crypto is very limited. But I think, I mentioned this in CoinDesk recently. I want to see a use case for crypto to be a vehicle for good in Afghanistan, to help with humanitarian assistance, to aid the Afghan people while not unjustly enriching the Taliban. And I think that's where the crypto community needs to focus its efforts, is to help the Afghan people and to really use the full might and the full power of this incredibly dynamic community to address this very real humanitarian crisis. And I know that the crypto community can step up to that challenge, again, with the appropriate controls, abiding by existing U.S. and international laws and norms to affect that, but to help the people on the ground in Afghanistan.